Hello and welcome to Mixing and Matching Poses with PoseMaster for DAZ Studio. In my scene I've loaded a red Genesis and a yellow Genesis. I'm just going to move them slightly so we can see what we're doing. And what I'm going to be doing here is combining parts of different other poses to create a new pose. So let's start off selecting red Genesis and going and applying a default Genesis pose. So I'm going to select one of the default Genesis poses. Let's choose the fashion pose and let's rotate red Genesis slightly. So we've got a pose applied to red Genesis and I'm going to copy that pose using PoseMaster copy. I'm just going to copy it to the default. I could type something else in here if I want to keep the pose, but default is just a temporary place to store the pose. So we've copied that pose now, and I can go and apply the pose to yellow Genesis. So I will now click PoseMaster Paste. We're selecting default, that's where we copied the pose to. I'm going to select all of the transforms, position, rotation and scale, and we will select recursive to apply the pose not only to the selected bone, which is the whole figure, but also to all of its children and grandchildren. If I click accept, as we can see, yellow Genesis has assumed the position and rotation and scale for the whole skeleton from red Genesis. I'm going to undo that and let me show you what happens if we uncheck recursive. Now it's going to apply the pose only to the selected bone, which is the whole figure. So as you can see, yellow Genesis assumes the position and the rotation and the scale, which is 1, of red Genesis. Let's undo that again. I can also select multiple bones. Let's choose the arms and the legs, and if I click PoseMaster Paste now and I select recursive, then PoseMaster is going to paste the pose from the collars down and from the thighs down. As you can see, yellow Genesis has adopted the red Genesis pose in its arms and legs only, but the abdomen, the torso and the neck and the head remain unchanged. I'm going to undo that again. Let's choose another pose. Let's choose the kneeling pose. Now what you've seen here is that red Genesis's hip has moved down. Now the convention is that the body, if I select the figure and I move it around the scene, the body is used to place the figure in the scene, and the hip is used to place the hip in pose wherever the figure is in scene. If I select red Genesis and copy that pose again, and I now apply that same pose only to the yellow Genesis figure, it moves to where the red Genesis body is positioned in the scene. As you can see, it's got the right position and rotation, but the hip has not moved. If we want to apply the red Genesis hip position to yellow Genesis, we need to select yellow Genesis hip and say PoseMaster Paste. As you can see, yellow Genesis has now assumed the same hip position as red Genesis. Let's undo that, and let's undo that. So what we can do now is, if we want to apply the lower body position, or the lower body pose of red Genesis, I select the pelvis. The pelvis is connected to the legs, the thighs. And if I could select PoseMaster Paste recursive, we now get the lower body pose of red Genesis. Right, now we would like to go and apply parts of different pose to yellow Genesis. So let's go back and find a pose where we have an interesting torso and head position. Here we go, leaning slightly left, female walking. The whole figure's pose has changed. That's okay, because I can copy that pose to default. I undo the pose we loaded, and now I can select yellow Genesis abdomen, so the pose will be applied to the torso, neck, head and arms. I click paste, position, rotation, scale and recursive. And now we've combined the upper body pose from the walking pose. And then what we can finally do, I click the whole figure again, and let's find a pose which has got a good arm position. The looking pose has got a good arm position. Once again, I copy that. Let's undo that pose loading, and now I'm going to select the collars and paste recursive. And there we get the arm position. As you can see, we've got a pose now on Yellow Genesis, which is a combination of the legs from one pose, the torso, head and neck from another pose, and the arms from a different pose. Now if we want to position Yellow Genesis where Red Genesis is, we select Red Genesis, copy that pose, we select Yellow Genesis, and now we need to paste only the position. If we uncheck recursive, only the figure's position will change, but we want to position the hip as well. So I will undo, and we can choose recursive. Now recursive will work because the only two bones which have position are the figure and the hip. All the other bones, the limbs, the torso, the neck and the head, only use positions, only use rotation and scale. As we can see, we've positioned the Yellow Genesis body and hip in place, but we would like the hip rotation to be aligned with Red Genesis. So if I select Edit, Undo, and I paste once again, I apply rotation. Oops, what's happened here? Undo. We selected rotation and recursive, which meant it applied the rotation of all of the bones to Yellow Genesis. So we could paste position recursively because it only applied position to the body and the hip, but we cannot do the same for rotation. So let's apply position recursively, so we get the body and hip in the right position. And now we need to select the hip, and we paste rotation. We can choose scale, but we haven't changed scale here, so it doesn't matter. I uncheck recursive because we only want to apply that to the hip bone. Right, now we've got the hip in the same position. That brings us to the end of this tutorial, mixing and matching different poses, and you should have a better understanding of how to pose figures, mix poses, and position a figure in a scene. Thank you.